On today's show, we're talking about how to identify and let go of old relationship patterns. And this is important, something I know we can all relate to. If you've ever had that experience, like the same kinds of things keep happening in your relationships, if you're dating and you wind up with the same kind of person in a different package over and over again, or if you notice themes or trends when it comes to your conflicts with friends or even coworkers, even thinking about the frustrating situations that you find yourself in over and over with your family, with your partner. All of these experiences, when you stand back and look at them all together, if you're noticing patterns, it is high time to be figuring out your relationship patterns so that you can begin to shift them on purpose and then have different experiences in your relationships going forward. So on today's podcast, we're going to be talking about a number of different strategies to help you gain self-awareness and also identify the kinds of patterns that you engage in so that you can be empowered to change them going forward. If this is your first time with the Love, Happiness, and Success podcast, I'm very happy to welcome you. I'm your host. I'm Dr. Lisa Marie Bobby. My background, I'm a marriage counselor. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, actually. I am also a licensed psychologist, and I am a board-certified coach. I'm the founder of Growing Self Counseling and Coaching. And I'm also the author of Xoxo, Breaking Your Addiction to an Ex-Love. And all of these different kinds of threads may sound not that similar, but they actually are. The theme running through my life, my relationships, is very much around service, being helpful to people. I am also a learner. I love figuring things out, and I feel like everything I do is a function of that in one way or the other. But I also am a very relational person, and so everything that I do in different aspects of my work, sooner or later, kind of trickles into matters of the heart, as well as growth, happiness, and success. Those are some of the themes in my life, and that's an example of figuring out core values and how you show up in the world and in your relationships so that you can identify both your strengths, but also the vulnerabilities, the growth edges that come along with all of those things. I'm going to be diving into some examples in my own life to illustrate this a little bit more for you. But I also wanted to introduce you to who I am and what this is about if this is your first time listening. So thank you for joining me today. And thank you for, coming here for a discussion around how to resolve relationship patterns. And I have to tell you, I love this topic so much because I say this as an experienced therapist, coach, marriage counselor. For many years, actually. And one of the things that I have frequently observed in my clients professionally, and I have also experienced this personally, people often show up in their work with me in a lot of pain because of different things that are happening in their relationships that feel hurtful or even frustrating for them, right? And very commonly, when we begin this work together, my clients are framing these experiences as the result of how other people are treating them. Their partner is not emotionally available. People are taking advantage of their generosity, aren't being as kind or thoughtful with them as they would like them to be. And all of those things are very true. Those are real experiences and are worth considering. People do get involved with the wrong kinds of people to have relationships with. That is totally valid. Recognizing that is really important so that you can make changes and get connected with people who are more available to have healthy relationships with you. And what is also true is that very frequently when people begin this growth process with me, they are not aware of the fact that the way they are showing up in their relationships is co-creating the kinds of experiences that they wind up having. And that after we can kind of dive into this and bring it to light, people are able to see their own relationship patterns, their own ways of relating, and how that essentially generates the type of experience that they can expect to have with other people, oftentimes over and over again. And it is difficult in some ways to realize that, because you have to think, oh, maybe it does have something to do with me and the way that I show up in my relationships, right? It's much more comfortable to blame other people for the experiences that we're having. However, when you realize that you're an active participant in co-creating the relationship experiences that you're having, you become empowered to have a totally different experience and much better relationships going forward that do not depend on other people deciding to behave differently all of a sudden. You're in control of it. And again, I know it doesn't always feel like you have that power. And truly, I mean, we can get into situations with people that are just happening to us, right? But one of the most important things to realize about relationships is that they're always systems, meaning that they impact different people simultaneously. So for example, two people in a relationship, person A, person B, person A will consciously or not put something out into the world that person B is going to have a reaction to, consciously or non-consciously. They will interpret it a certain way. They will run it through their own mental filter. And, oftentimes by virtue of their own relationship patterns or expectations, they will respond to that. So person B responds to person A, and then person A takes that response, runs it through their kind of rule book about how people should be, expectations, old pain points, core beliefs, and will respond to that, which will then in turn elicit another response. So a relationship system is always two or more people responding to each other. This is really, really important to know, because what we put into these systems will always impact what we get back from other people. We cannot control or change other people, but when we are aware of how we are showing up and then make some changes related to that, it's going to have a different response. It will elicit a different response from other people. Or we can become aware of the whole system, like what I'm doing, what you're doing, and what I'm doing back. And we can choose to maybe even not participate if it's healthier not to do so. We can identify it and then step out. So that's what we're talking about on today's episode. We're going to be exploring some common relationship patterns. We're going to be talking about how and why people get stuck in them, particularly when it comes to relational systems, and how you can break free. So I'm glad that you're here today for this important conversation, and I really hope that you get a lot out of it. So first of all, let's talk about some of these relationship patterns and just to kind of wrap our heads around what's happening here. First of all, the most important thing to be aware of is that when it comes to relationship patterns that are yours, one of the easiest ways to identify them is to do some thinking about what is really familiar. And this can be challenging, but it is so productive. I'll just tell you a personal story. I mean, I've been doing personal growth work since my 20s. Gosh, even before that. My mom was really into Tony Robbins, and I had self-help books all over the house that I loved reading when I was growing up. But then, my first experience with a therapist was in my 20s, and I have consistently, in some form or fashion, been doing personal growth work ever since then, right? And so I like to think that I have a fair amount of self-awareness at this point, hard won, and yet I am still vulnerable to these old relationship patterns. It's really easy for me to fall into if I'm not mindful of it. And the way that I have found for myself and also my clients is to think about what areas of life feel familiar. So you kind of have to like turn the sound off, right? Like it's not about the specific humans that you're interacting with. It's not about the specific situations. It involves tapping into the feelings of familiarity. So, for example, one of my old patterns that I am still working on, but is this tendency to take on more than is my fair share a lot of times of the responsibility for different things. I think it goes into feeling kind of chronically guilty about a variety of things. I think it's also related to being a fairly strong, competent person. Like I can do a lot of things. It's not that hard for me to do things. And so I tend to pick up slack where I see slack. I tend to step in and just kind of if something needs to be done, I'll do it. So all positive things. It's tied to positive personality qualities, a sense of personal responsibility, self-efficacy, being a good problem solver. But the pattern that is very easy for me to fall into in my relationships is that I start overdoing things, taking responsibility for things that it's actually okay for other people to be handling or managing. And people get used to me doing things for them. So they're like, oh, well, Lisa's going to take care of it, so I don't have to do it anymore. Which then leads me to feel tired, overwhelmed, like I have way too much on my plate. And over time, if I'm not careful, I can start to feel resentful of that. And so that is an example of a relationship pattern that I contribute to. I mean, I am very much like making that happen, but it's so easy to, especially if we isolate it to like one instance, like having it be about a specific person. I'm always picking up the slack from my coworker, or, my kid just leaves all his stuff on the floor and expects me to pick it up. Or, my husband just assumes that I'm going to take care of like X, Y, Z. It's very easy for all of us to get hyper-focused in these relationships about what the other person is doing or not doing. But this is what I mean. Like you have to turn off the sound, stop thinking about the particular people, and instead think about the feeling. So the example in my life is that it's feeling overwhelmed. It's feeling like I have too many responsibilities. My to-do list is 3 feet long and everybody else is like sitting around playing video games, taking 3-hour lunch breaks. Like it's the feeling of what that is. And then it's from that comes the question, what is it about my way of being that is contributing to that experience? That's the aha. That's what opens the door and allows for some deeper exploration around, I don't ask a whole lot of other people. I take things on myself and I think expect that other people will do the same. And if I'm not talking about how I feel or saying things out loud or creating accountability for other people, I'm going to feel this way. So that's just an example. And this is true for all of us. We all have these unconscious core beliefs and expectations. We have this very natural way of operating that we probably arrived at like sometime in late childhood or early teens, right? And there is a real disconnect between our conscious and our subconscious beliefs about who we are, what we do, what other people do. And this is where it becomes difficult, is being able to kind of shine the light on our own part of this process. But this is incredibly important work, because when we are able to notice who we are, what we're doing, what the inner beliefs are, what that like mental tape is, that launches us on a fantastically powerful opportunity for personal growth. That is personal growth, right? It's figuring out like, how am I thinking? How am I feeling? How am I behaving? What are some things that I would like to change? How am I going to handle these situations next time in a different way that feels better for me and helps me have healthier, happier relationships with the people that I care about? So this is personal growth that then very much turns into relational growth. It transforms our relationships when we can identify our patterns and do this kind of work. So like the equation here is that if you are feeling frustrated with somebody in your life, think about what that is, not the context, not the story, but the feeling. What is the frustration? Overwhelmed, dumped on, like I have to do everything. Okay, that's the feeling. And then cast around in your mind for, when else have I felt that way in my life? Who else do I currently kind of feel that way with in my life? And then it turns into yes, this is a pattern for me. And then turns into personal growth work where we can make some important changes and then bring those back into the experience of our relationships. And it's going to feel different for us and also for the person on the other end. I will also just tell you, like full disclosure, is that if you have been in a comfy relationship system with somebody else for a long time, meaning that you guys have each basically taught each other what to expect from each other, like this is how I'm going to behave, this is how you're going to behave, like these meta messages in a relationship. When you start showing up differently, particularly if it makes somebody else on the other side less comfy than maybe they have in the past, there's going to be some turbulence. There's often going to be an effort for that system to kind of go back to the way that it was. This is particularly true with family systems. It's easier, I think, with two people, like in a couple, although you will absolutely get pushback with your partner when you all of a sudden start showing up in a different way in the relationship. They're going to be like, wait, what? No, this isn't what we do. Subconsciously, they try to re-engage in those old relationship dynamics with you. And this is one of the reasons why it can be very, very helpful, if not necessary, to get connected with a really good, ideally licensed marriage and family therapist if you've identified some relationship patterns that need to change, because good marriage counselor is trained in the kinds of systems theory that I'm talking about, and they will be able to work with you to change the system and support those changes, because otherwise the system will collapse back into the old way of being pretty easily. So I just wanted to put that out there, that if this feels hard to create change on your own, it actually does, and that's a sign that you could use some support if it's an established relationship system. So the next thing to be aware of when it comes to these kinds of relational dynamics is the power of self-awareness. We've already talked about some of this, like how to identify those patterns, but I have a few additional tips here. When you go back to the example that I shared at the beginning of this, like related to my own relationship patterns, the salient point here is that I was creating this relationship system that ultimately didn't feel good to me. And it comes from my core values, my ideas, my actions, right? I'm putting those things out into the world, and it's impacting the way that other people experience me, just like it is with everybody. Like, this isn't a Lisa thing. We all do this. So the powerful part here, and the thing to unpack, is that I'm not in relationships with uniquely bad people who want to take advantage of my generosity. I'm not in relationships with people who are unusually lazy necessarily, or prone to absconding, responsibility and putting things on other people. I invite that because of my own relationship patterns. If something needs to be done, I will just raise my hand and say, oh, I'll do it. I'll do the XYZ, right? Not really thinking about sometimes how much work it's going to be or how many other things that I have on my plate, right? And so it's identifying what is the trigger that makes me raise my hand and say, oh, yes, load that right up on my plate. No problem. And it comes back to those core values and personality characteristics that I told you about earlier. So this is even just a stopping point, if you're listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube, to pull out a notebook, open up a fresh doc, and just answer this one question. What is the most annoying pain point that you are experiencing in your relationships right now? I'll give you a second just to think about what that is, or better yet, write it down. What do you feel frustrated about? What is hurting your feelings? And is it familiar? Let's just write down the name of that. And now I would invite you to consider, what is it about your core values and your core beliefs and your personality that is contributing to that experience? And frame it in positive ways. You know, like when you were hearing me talk through my own relationship patterns, it's connected to competence and problem solving and a tendency towards, being responsible, being a hard worker. Like those are all good things. But what is it about the best qualities of yourself that contribute to your getting into this pattern over and over again? Because all values, all strengths have two sides. Right? There's light and dark in all things. So the things that we embrace and appreciate about ourselves are to be celebrated and amplified, certainly. But we always need to be aware of the dark side of those so that we can manage it. So, for example, being a very responsible person can also mean turning into a martyr in relationships, the person who does everything for everybody. That also is connected to being a loving and kind and generous person. We give, we do things for other people. The dark side starts, being a doormat that gets everything dumped on them. So there's two different pieces of that. And so I'm going to give you just a moment here, and you're welcome to stop this if you want a little bit more time to think about what those light and dark things are for you. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube, I would love to hear about this in the comments section. You can go ahead and do your little journaling exercise right here. What are your personal strengths, the dark side of which is related to your relationship patterns that don't feel so good? Think about what they are. Okay, with that in mind, now I'd like to shift over into discussing the usual suspects, the different relationship pattern archetypes, and just a few of them, honestly. I mean, there are so many more, but I want to talk through some of these typical ones because understanding what some of these are can help you identify your own tendencies in relationships with other people. And I will tell you, as we talk through this, it's going to be easier for you to see these types in other people. So as I talk through them, I bet you're going to say to yourself, oh yes, I know that. I know what that looks like. I know a person who's like that. And so that is fantastic. But I also want you to think about how you respond to that, because that's also going to give you some visibility around your own relational patterns. And as you listen to these, I want you again to think about the relational systems and what these kinds of people pull from you, because this is going to help you get clarity. And then we're going to shift into talking about what to do differently. So first of all, as we have begun to discuss in my own relationships, my own way of being. Okay, so there's a martyr archetype, right? And this is it can be defined by over-servicing other people, over-responsibility at the expense of oneself many times. That also really turns into like codependent relational dynamics. One person is over-functioning in a relationship, giving more, doing more, taking care of the things. And what happens in those relational systems is that when one person is over-functioning, other people start under-functioning. So if you have listened to a podcast that I recorded a while ago on codependent relationships, this is what it is. If one person is under-functioning and the other person is like up to here with energy, trying to like keep everything together, and it's not healthy for either person. But it's very much a thing. Martyr tendencies are often very much connected to things like people pleasing. Making people feel happy and comfy can also be related to conflict avoidance. Can also, interestingly, be connected to passive aggressive tendencies. Saying yes, saying it's fine, no, everything's okay, but kind of feeling bad about it and showing those bad feelings in other ways. Again, I have a podcast on this type of relational pattern, but a tendency towards martyrdom can show up in all kinds of other flavors. Oh, including perfectionism, like to have perfectionistic kinds of tendencies in relationships, needing things to be just right, having a lot of ideas about the way that things should be. This actually also flows into a tendency towards superiority. And think if you know anybody like this in your life. So somebody with a superior or even a supremacist type orientation, the core belief there is my way of being in the world, my way of thinking, my perspective is the correct one. I'm right, other people are wrong. And when other people are behaving in incorrect ways, as per my definition, I'm going to feel angry about that and disappointed about that. So, think about if you've ever met somebody like that who has a lot of rules and who is very confident in their own point of view. That is a relational pattern type. And you will notice when you think about somebody who has those superior tendencies, what does that do to you when you're around people like that? Do you get angry and do you want to fight with them? Do you work harder to make them happy, thinking that you might be able to earn their love and affection and approval? If so, you may have just identified yourself as being a please love me type. There's another relational pattern where people get very focused on trying to win love, attention, affection, approval, confirmation, external validation from others. And they're often really old and important reasons for this that can go all the way back into childhood, having parents who had very definite, fairly rigid ideas about the way things should be, and the way to earn love and approval was, as a child, to conform to those or to perform according to, the whatever standards they were. And so if you notice yourself, one of your patterns is that you're always with people who are emotionally unavailable or who seem to be annoyed with you, or who you crave attention, affection, approval from, but it seems like you can never get it, that would be an indication that it's time just to do a little check in yourself. Like, am I like really hoping that people are going to love me if I could just be good enough, right? And so the thing here is to think about, what does that make me do in relationships? How do I elicit that? It can be connected even like to low self-esteem, sort of putting another person up just a little bit higher than you are, idealizing some people, putting yourself kind of at a lower level in relation to them, kind of like looking up at others, and just noticing that, if that's a pattern for you. So there's also a victim archetype. And this is somebody who has a self-concept that they are being hurt, harmed, mistreated, disappointed by other people over and over again, that, bad things and misfortune befall them because of the failures of others. So everybody in their lives is a narcissist or abusive or gaslighting them or whatever it is. And it's really just like feeling like people are out to get them. People are fundamentally untrustworthy, and sooner or later, they're going to be hurt by someone else. I'm sure you have met a victim. There's also a victim of circumstance. Maybe you've had a friend for a long time that you've seen go through, job to job and kind of getting into similar patterns in every situation. Nasty bosses, rude coworkers, like what are the patterns? What's coming up over and over again? But the theme is victimization. And then think about, what is your relationship in response to that? Do you tend to go into problem solving, caretaking? I mean, caretaking is another really significant pattern that can go along with martyrdom, but it can be a little bit different. Is your friend spending hours and hours and hours telling you about all the horrible things that have happened and how terrible her life is? And you're like, and, spending your whole Saturday night doing that, as opposed to doing things that would fill your cup in more meaningful ways. Other relational patterns. There's a Peter Pan kind of archetype, somebody who is forever young and not necessarily in the best way. Forever young, certainly, maybe being interested in things that are more youthful, running around parties, bacchanalian adventures of one kind or another, but also having a tendency to foist off responsibilities on other people, prioritize having fun over things that need to get done. And also, I think having a expectation of being cared for by others, somebody who might sit around all day playing video games and the house is actually a mess and needs to be cleaned. That can be a relationship pattern. It might even be interesting to consider, if you are thinking back about your patterns in relationships and feel like you've been in relationships over and over and over again. The theme is that people are being very critical of you, mad at you, making demands of you, being controlling of you. Consider how perhaps an orientation towards a Peter Pan kind of dynamic, or even a prince/princess of leisure dynamic, closely related, could potentially be contributing to other people being upset with you or giving you a hard time. Again, not saying all this to make you feel bad, but if you become aware of this in yourself and realize how your way of being is eliciting certain reaction patterns from other people, then it allows you to be empowered to do things differently. So again, it's worth being aware of, to identify these unhelpful relationship patterns. And then also there's, I think of kind of a cynic relationship pattern, pessimistic, negative, cynical, can be associated with a, superior way of being, or also potentially a victim mindset. But a cynic tends to see the problems in every situation. And oftentimes there's a very protective component to that, right? Going into the light and dark of all things. The strengths related to being a cynic is that you're protective, probably a realist, being able to think into the future and see problems in advance. None of those are bad things. No more so than with some of the other relationship patterns that we've been talking about. I mean, a Peter Pan or princess of leisure orientation. There are so many positive qualities there, like enjoying life, being able to relax, being flexible when it comes to your priorities, being able to let things go and have a stress-free existence. Those are all really, really positive things. They're usually quite optimistic, actually, and having a good time. And, nobody's mad at you for that. But it's thinking about what are the dark sides of that relational pattern and how is it getting in the way of me having the kinds of relationships that I want. And so, if there's this tendency towards cynicism, think about that person in your life who meets that criteria, but also think about how you respond to them in order to uncover your own dynamics. If you interact with a cynic, do you kind of disengage? Do you work harder to try to please or appease them? Do you go into caretaking mode? Do you become passive aggressive? I mean, like, what does this do to you? Because again, this will just highlight how you can show up. I know that it's not particularly comfortable to think about these different relationship patterns and how we may be participating in them. I think it's easier to be able to identify and see these in other people. But it's valuable because this shines a light in the direction of empowerment when we can understand with compassion how we show up, but also why, and how it's oftentimes very much related to our values and our strengths. All of a sudden, we have so many new opportunities for how to be a little bit differently than others, so that we can start having better experiences with other people. So, moving on, the next thing that we're going to be talking about is how to begin changing some of these patterns in ourselves in order to have better experiences with other people. And I do have some specific recommendations for you. The first one goes to the idea of personal responsibility and also empowerment. If you've listened to this podcast before, you've heard me say many, many times that, again, you cannot change other people. You can only change yourself. But in doing so, it really does change your relationship systems. So, for example, I went through a period of time where I was really frustrated with my teenager for not doing XYZ things around the house that he should be doing. And I was having to do them and becoming increasingly kind of annoyed because I have this long-standing pattern of like over-mothering, right? Like doing things for him. He can do those things for himself, but I needed to adjust, as a mom of a growing kid, right? Like a teenager doesn't need the same level of parenting or support as a 3-year-old. So I needed to take a step back. And in doing that and being able to say out loud, you can fold your own laundry, you can make your own lunch, you can XYZ, and allowing him opportunities to do these things. At first, of course, he's like, wait, what, how do I do that? Maybe he needed a little bit of a lesson, but it set a different kind of expectation and also layers of accountability, right? But first of all, I had to feel empowered to be able to recognize what I was doing that perpetuated this and be able to take corrective action so that he could step forward into a place of greater autonomy and learn and develop new skills and be taking more responsibility for himself. Another example, if you've noted in yourself that maybe you have a tendency to please people, kind of hoping to get love and attention from them or to win their approval, and you've noticed this because the pattern for you is being in relationships with people who feel like they don't love you or approve of you, make you feel less than, like their needs, rights, and feelings are more important, to be thinking about, okay, well, what is it about me that's contributing to that? A way of correcting this dynamic is to start acknowledging your own needs, your own rights, your own feelings, and not just asking for them, but expecting them to be met, and obviously doing it in positive ways, but having courageous conversations around like, I feel like I am giving you a lot of love and affection and tolerance and all these, things. I'm trying to make you feel good, but I've realized that it's honestly about me wanting to feel like you love me and approve of me. I've been working way too hard to try to get that from you. I'm going to stop that and take a step back and give you opportunities to step forward and love me according to your love language. I'm going to be taking a step back and also maybe setting some healthier boundaries If you do treat me in ways that don't feel good to me and aren't, reasonable expectations of being loved and cared for, I might be making some different decisions about how I'm going to be showing up in this relationship. I might be pushing back on things that I have tolerated or accepted from you in the past. And so you should be prepared for that, because what I need and want and how I feel is actually just as important in this relationship as your needs, rights, and feelings. I'm not saying it's more important, but there needs to be a place here for me too. That is a courageous conversation. It's hard to have. I will advise that it might be in everybody's best interests if you tackle that in the safe office of a good marriage and family therapist who can support you in creating those positive changes. But it's really interesting because what you will see, particularly with support, is that when you step back and start showing up as somebody who has more self-love, more self-esteem, higher expectations of other people, people will respond to that in more respectful and generous ways. It's really interesting how those things will work. If you have identified a pattern in yourself of oftentimes feeling victimized or harmed by other people, that would be a really important pattern to take in front of a good therapist to unpack. In my experience, people who feel victimized routinely by others have often not been treated well at earlier times in their lives. They have had people do sometimes really terrible things to them. And from that has developed a narrative around, like, this is what I can expect from other humans. So if you feel like you get hurt over and over and over again by people who are behaving in egregious ways towards you, I would strongly encourage you to take that in front of a good therapist to unpack that, connect some dots, understand what that's about, and begin the process of learning how to trust again in emotionally safe and healthy ways with people who are trustworthy, just understanding that it's going to be a little bit of a process there. And so we could go into so many more recommendations for all of these different personality types. I know we've just been scratching the surface. This is a very deep and complex subject, and one that we talk about a lot, in couples counseling at Growing Self, but also in individual therapy and individual coaching. Interestingly, also in career counseling and coaching. Many times people experience stressful situations and relationships related to their professional lives, and oftentimes our relational patterns can sometimes even be the most obvious in our professional roles. And so I hope you don't think of career counseling or coaching as just being about, like, how do I figure out what I want to be when I grow up and get a job? It's unpacking, how do I show up in my professional life? How do I develop the kind of emotional intelligence and communication and relational skills that will help me thrive in my chosen profession, feel connected and collaborative with others, but also be able to, do great work that's in alignment with my most important personal values, like this mission in the world that I'm on. Our relationship patterns can oftentimes come up in that realm as well. So, as I've referenced over the course of this podcast, I have a ton of different episodes related to different aspects of this. You can scroll through, if you come to growingself.com and go to the blog and podcast page, so blog-podcast, and then you'll land on a number of different content collections. And in every single one of them, you will find additional articles and curated podcast playlists that dive into different aspects of this. The most important one, I think, to start with, if you go into the love collection and then from there find the healthy relationships content collection, you'll be able to find a curated podcast playlist and also articles with things like dealing with passive-aggressive people, perfectionistic tendencies, people-pleasing tendencies, how to set healthier boundaries with other people. We have episodes related to controlling behaviors, what to do if you're in love with a narcissist, even if you have a person with superiority tendencies in your life that are quite pronounced. But also going into like self-esteem, how to love yourself are all really salient in doing the kinds of personal growth that we've talked about today. Because when it comes to changing your patterns in relationships, just know these things go really deep inside of us all. They are not easy to change, and it oftentimes requires a lot of self-awareness, insight, and guidance, quite frankly, from a really good therapist or potentially a coach. I say that with some trepidation quickly. Most coaches don't have any training at all. It's an unregulated profession. Anybody can be a coach. No education or qualifications needed. And there are some people who are excellent therapists who use a very powerful coaching modality to help you move forward further faster. So like at Growing Self, everybody on our team is a licensed therapist, and we all practice really powerful coaching. So there can be a lot of benefit from that, particularly if you are really eager to just overcome the obstacles and take action in order to get different results. Coaching can sometimes really be the way to go. Just make sure that you connect with the right person to do that. And so those are my recommendations for you. I hope that this overview was helpful. Again, I know it was fast and this was a huge topic, so we didn't get to go into any of it super deeply, but I hope that the resources and the activities that we discussed today help you get at least a first layer of insight and self-awareness, and also some direction on how to continue this journey of growth so that you get to grow and evolve, and in doing so have the opportunity to transform your relationships in a really positive way. So thank you for spending this time with me today, and I'll be back in touch next week with another episode of the podcast.